We often say, in order to improve, study the games of the great ones. But you know what? The great ones can be kids too. This is going to be 4 positional chess lessons from 4 aspiring chess kids. They all came from the same tournament, the Charlotte Chess Center Spring Invitational. And let's watch these young kids teach us as though they were grandmasters. Here, Black is the fantastic Brewington Hardaway, and he played a common yet instructive idea when you're playing against the King's Indian attack. In this game, he recognized that this center pawn is holding up all of Black's pieces, so he correctly gives away a side pawn for a center pawn. Very instructive. Now, this pawn is about to come to the square g4, and when the knight moves, this pawn's going to be lost for nothing. So White had to accept the side pawn for the center pawn, and now White made a further mistake here by allowing the trade of queens, because Brewington kicks this knight, and because that center pawn is gone, he's now able to play e5, keeping this knight shut out of the game. In fact, in just a couple more moves, he ended up playing f5, and with complete control of the center of the chessboard, he went on to beat an international master later in the game. A great lesson. Our next positional concept is turned in by women's international master Alice Lee, who, I'll be honest with you, I learned something from this game. Because as Black here, her opponent, by the way, a grandmaster, played the move c5. And I was very worried for Alice because it looks like the outpost on d6 is going to spell trouble. But it turns out the lesson here is that not all outposts are created equal. She has effective ways of dealing with any sort of knight invasion on d6. However, White, by playing c5, also gave Alice an outpost, and it turns out White is not as capable of dealing with this outpost. It is, after all, a light square. White has no light squared bishop, and Black has multiple knights that can move through the f6 square to get to d5. So the lesson here, not all outposts are created equal. In fact, Black is already a little bit better. Now, she first moves her queen back to prevent bishop to f4, and the grandmaster says, I'm going to get my bishop there. And I was still worried for Alice, but she very calmly developed her last piece to f6. And after bishop to f4, she gave a check, so there was no invasion on d6 just yet. And after the queen goes to the square c3, she just very calmly moved her queen back. Now, you still might be wondering, what about this outpost on d6? Well, it turns out here, if the knight gives a check, you can take that knight, and after bishop takes, you just make a fork on e4, get rid of this bishop, and that pawn on d6, it is a wedge pawn, but because they're going to be doubled and isolated, I would definitely say that that pawn will be more weak than strong. So we'll just give the queen some sort of move, and after we take, and pawn takes, I think White is going to be stuck trying to defend this pawn most of the game. It doesn't really cramp Black's pieces because Black doesn't have that many pieces to begin with. Now, if we go back to the game, in the actual game, instead of knight to d6, we had knight goes back to d2, and after Alice's knight went to d5, you can see her knight is the best knight on the board. Her outpost is much more important than the d6 outpost ended up being. A fantastic idea. She went on to beat her first ever grandmaster as Black later on in this game. Our next lesson is turned in by 2-time ChessKid U Speed Chess Champion, FIDE Master Ryo Chen. This game is actually pretty equal. Maybe Black's even a little bit better. And the lesson here is actually pretty simple. Even in a game where everything looks same, if you have control of the only open file on the board, that is often enough to win. I believe Black made a small mistake by playing c5, although it does make sense to try to attack the white king. But after takes and takes, the d file is now open, and Ryo, not only does he already have a rook on the open file, he's able to get a second rook there. Now, he has to take care of his king's safety for just one moment, but after rook to d8, he insists on controlling the file, and I'm just going to fast forward a few more moves after the queens trade off the chessboard. And if we pause at this spot in the endgame, White has all of the advantages. Complete control of the open file, rook on the 7th rank, Black has the weakest pawns, and if you add all of that up, it turned into a win. I'm just going to play a couple more moves. He decides to trade rooks, and Black actually gave away this pawn rather than just go into the rook endgame where he has the really passive rook, because I think the white king would walk up the board and probably capture both of these pawns. So in this position, black went for activity, which I do praise. We have that video on ChessKid about active versus passive defense. But after rook c5, there's not a lot of activity, and Ryo wins a pawn, comes back to defend, and with his extra pawn and his 3-on-1 advantage on the queen side, he went on to win. So there you go. Even just owning one open file of the board can often win you a chess game. And last but not least, we have to highlight the awesome idea by FIDE master Tani Adewumi, but you just know him as Tani. My name is Tani. No, his name is Tani, but we're going to learn from him. Here, he is black, and Tani loves tactics. Unfortunately, black doesn't have a lot of space in this position. It's actually even a little bit hard for black to find a plan. So what's the positional lesson? Sometimes when you can't come up with something productive to do, you have to throw a pawn at your opponent to get activity. In fact, I think on ChessKid, we have a video about the poisoned pawn, which is the B pawn, and that's kind of what ends up happening here. Tani plays A5, and if he's able to get this pawn to B4 and this bishop to A6, his pieces are starting to do something. Now, for the moment, he does temporarily undefend this pawn, and white says, "Thank you very much for the breakfast," and Tani says, "Thank you very much for the activity." You can see in the course of just those two moves, one move for each side, black already has a fancy bishop, an open file for the rook, an attack on the queen, juicy square for the knight, and yeah, he doesn't like his queen being on the same file as the rook, but other than that, Tani's got a lot going for him. The queen actually has to be really careful not to get trapped. For example, if she chooses this poor square, then the knight hops to b6, where is she going now? Yeah, I don't feel so good about that queen. Okay, what ended up happening in the game is the queen went to b3. Tani played bishop c4. The queen has to go to c3. And after bishop b4, he's already getting his pawn back by force. Because after takes, now he's got the open a file. And when the queen moves, he gets his pawn back. And if I just play one more move here, knight to b6, backing up the bishop, and you can see suddenly all of black's pieces are starting to make sense. Now, white is still very much in the game, but it's so much easier to play chess when you have active pieces and an active plan. So I fully support Tani's decision to give away that pawn. He actually ended up going on to win this game. Well, there you go. 4 fantastic positional chess ideas turned in by kids who are maybe younger than you. I learned a lot from them. I hope you did too. And we look forward to all of these kids' journey to IM and beyond.